Hello, everyone. You're very welcome to the last keynote of the session as we prepare to end the conference. I'm Kathleen Donnelly. I co-chair the conference with my colleague and fellow trustee Bethany Kelly. And I have the privilege of introducing Professor Toby Greany. Just before I do that, anyone who's doing a poster session, just to let you know that the room is the library terrace rather than the Renaissance suite. So just want to get that out of the way first. Okay, so just to introduce Toby, great pleasure to introduce Toby, is Professor of Education at the University of Nottingham and co-director of the Centre for Research in Educational Leadership and Management. He is widely recognised as one of the leading thinkers in education leadership and policy, and the significance of his work lies in how skillfully it bridges research, policy and practice. He has substance and clarity in doing so. So there's no sense in which Toby's work just sits in academic libraries gathering dust, like many of our works. Whether he's exploring system reform, multi-academy trusts, or the role of evidence in decision-making and leadership sustainability, Toby brings not only rigour, but also real humanity to the conversation that I think we'll see in his speech today.
Too many things to hold now. So, thank you, Kathleen. That's lovely. And thank you to all of you for getting up early on a Sunday morning. Thanks to the team at BELMAS. I'm really grateful. It's lovely to be invited, to Kelly and everyone for helping organise things for me so brilliantly. It's been a really good conference, and not surprisingly, almost as if by design, lots of the things that people have talked about during the panel session, the first panel session. Mike Bottery obviously has been talking about sustainable leadership for several years. The session yesterday that we had with Anne Lopez, talking about some of the kind of challenges we face globally and how we respond as leaders in education. These themes, I think, will be picked up. You'll see them in my talk this morning. So I'm going to talk about sustainable school leadership in turbulent times. I'm also going to talk about reform and development. I'm going to draw on the sustainable school leadership study that I've been working on over the last 2.5 years or so with Tom Perry and Mike Collins, who are here today, Pat Thompson, who can't be here. She's in Australia. Also have other colleagues here, including Kathleen. Kathleen helped us put together the advisory group in Northern Ireland, which has been incredibly helpful in terms of steering the work. And similarly, the advisory group in Scotland, I'm not sure if Julie's here, but she's a member of that group. So lots of friends and colleagues who've helped to kind of shape that work. And I'm going to draw on it. I'm not going to kind of talk lots about the findings, but it kind of informs the overall argument that I want to make. And if I summarize the argument, kind of tell them what you're going to say it, tell them what you said. The crux of it is we're facing these global challenges, which we've been talking about. I'm going to use this idea of polycrisis that Edgar Morin has kind of talked about over several decades, and try and argue that, you know, education isn't always prioritized in these discussions about the polycrisis and how we might respond to it, but clearly children are affected by it, families are affected, communities and schools are very much affected by the polycrisis. And so in that context, one of the challenges I think we face is how do we think about governance of school systems? What we recognize is that schools are generally held accountable for a relatively kind of narrow, focused set of educational outcomes. And yet what we see in our research is that school leaders are responding to the aspects of the polycrisis. They're having to respond to the changes in children's lives post-pandemic, and yet the system is not recognizing that. It's not flexing and responding to allow that to happen. And so I want to talk about kind of what we might do differently and use this idea of local solutions. How do we try and think about policy, practice, working together to develop local solutions to the challenges we face in communities and the kinds of leadership required for that. So that's broadly where I'm going. I thought I'd just briefly kind of introduce myself a bit and position myself in this argument. I've put some of the key steps in my career up there. You can see that before I went into academia, I was working in a variety of kind of voluntary sector and government agency roles. And so I have this strong kind of interest in research, policy and practice, and probably that policy experience working at the National College, particularly trying to think about kind of how do we use research to inform policy, but equally use research to inform practice, and how does that come together? And that's been then reflected in the work that I've done since I went to UCL in 2013, joining Nottingham in 2018. I've put the book, the Andy Hargreaves and Dean Fink book up. That was published, I think, 2005. And the reason I put it up is that I talked about it at my interview when I went for the job at the National College in 2006. And I've always thought that was one of the reasons I maybe got the job. I showed that I knew something about leadership and the debates that were going on at the time. But it's interesting that now, nearly 20 years later, I'm working with colleagues on a study about the same set of issues, the same sustainable leadership topics that Andy and Dean were talking about then. How do we try and create more sustainable models to grow and develop and support leaders to be successful in what they do? The 8 principles that they set out in terms of depth and breadth and kind of ethical leadership, and how important that is for thinking about the future as well as the present in our educational work. So that very much kind of resonates for me. Few of the kind of books and projects that I've done over the years, just to give you a flavour of things that I've worked on. So that first book, School Leadership and Education System Reform, that I edited with Peter Early, reflects that interest in kind of policy, practice, and how they come together. I'm interested in how things work within schools, how leaders support professional learning for teachers, how they collaborate. Lots of interest in kind of networks, collaboration, leading beyond the school as well as within schools. The Hierarchy Markets Network study I'm going to draw on a little bit in my talk today, but was a big study I did with Rob Hyam, looking at how the reforms in England, particularly things like academisation, were playing out across 4 different localities that we studied, and the governance mechanisms and how they influence and shape the work of leaders is something I'm really interested in. Few more. So I did the series of reports that we called Leading in Lockdown with Pat Thompson, that were the backdrop to the Sustainable School Leadership study, where we looked at the impact of the pandemic and how leaders were working through the pandemic. Study I did with Eleanor, who's here, and other colleagues, called Belonging Schools, looking at inclusion in mainstream secondary schools, that we published last year. Multi-academy trusts, as Kathleen said, and then a couple of, over on the right, a couple that are place-based, so the Local Learning Landscapes report, and I'm going to refer to the Local Ed, Forging Local Coherence report. I'm really interested in this kind of place-based aspect of how leaders work across localities. So when we put in the proposal to ESRC for the funding for the Sustainable School Leadership research, we started with this argument that over the course of 40, 50 years, we've built up an evidence base around leadership, successful leadership, the core of which is that leadership makes a difference. We need high quality leaders in schools, that they can improve outcomes indirectly through their influence on school cultures, school learning. This is from a meta-analysis that's 20 years old. There are more recent ones that are not quite as kind of dramatic in terms of their claims around the impact that leaders make, but I've used it because it is so dramatic, claiming that there's a 20 percentile point increase as a result of high quality leadership. And over on the right, the quote from Chris Day and Pam Salmons and colleagues highlighting the core kind of tenets of that. And if any of you were here for the talk that Anna gave on Friday about the UNESCO report, you could hear very much this same message, that it's a combination of kind of transformational leadership, instructional leadership, distributed leadership, that seem to be the kind of core of successful leadership that makes a difference to student outcomes. And we see that written into head teacher standards, school leadership development programs around the world. And when we made the proposal for the research, our argument was, this is, helpful in lots of ways. Pat and Helen Gunter have talked about it as a transnational leadership package. It's become a truism. But what we were interested in exploring is, in a post-pandemic world where we know that things are changing for children and families and communities, is it still how are things moving on? What's it like leading schools today? To what extent is this transnational leadership package still helpful as we think about sustainable leadership? So I use this cartoon when I'm talking to school leaders, and often talking about the pandemic. And we faced this kind of huge crisis, global crisis. And what we saw was that, the national leadership probably did reflect this cartoon, certainly here in the UK. We had some quite confusing and dangerous leadership going on nationally at that time. Huge kind of confusion, complexity, lack of clarity around what we needed to happen. And so what we saw in our research, the Leading in Lockdown research, was that school leaders stepped up. They were making difficult decisions with limited information, often conflicting information, sometimes life or death decisions about whether or not to open or close the school or send a bubble home, and all those kind of difficult things that people were grappling with. And we saw that this was, some of the people we interviewed found this invigorating and kind of, this is the best time for leadership because I really feel I'm connecting with families in a different way. I feel like we're really central to holding this community together at a difficult time. But we also saw that people became tired and kind of worn out. They were unsettled by the constant change, the lack of clarity. Pat and I wrote an article on the back of that, where we looked at how in the years kind of after the lockdowns, 2021, 2022, leaders re-established routines in schools. They kind of, we used Lefebvre to talk about kind of rhythm analysis and how unsettling it was, but equally how by re-establishing the routines, the day, the week, the timetable, the year, this was partly about kind of the grammar of schooling that Tyack and Cuban talk about, but also I think highlights that when we closed schools, we saw that it had a hugely negative impact on children, that learning on your own in your bedroom in front of a computer was hugely problematic for children's health, their well-being, their opportunities to come together, to socialize, to kind of explore their identities and to develop as fully grown people. And these are the kind of invisible benefits of schooling that we risk losing sight of when we always focus on the academic outcomes, but the pandemic reminded us why schooling is so important for all sorts of reasons that go beyond the academics. So the pandemic was a crisis. Feels as if we're through the worst of that, although we're seeing the long run impact of that on children. And we've had a number of sessions talking about how children going through school today who grew up through that period maybe didn't have early years opportunities to engage with other children and so on. We're still seeing the impact of that. I'm not saying it's all over. But what I want to argue is that we're facing this other set of crises, or this parallel set of crises, which Edgar Morin, working with Andrejit Kern back in the 90s, coined the term polycrisis to kind of capture this sense of interconnecting crises that feed off each other, interact in ways that it can become hard to then predict quite what the outcome will be, what the impact will be, and how that will play out. So since then, others have picked up this idea. I'm drawing particularly here on the work of Michael Lawrence and a team at the Cascade Institute, who helpfully provide definitions and distinguish between the crisis in a single system, and they talk about how within a single system, often you see long-term kind of stress or degradation in the system, and then some kind of trigger event which causes the crisis. So think of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which kind of highlighted how the subprime mortgage, kind of issues in the US and kicked off a global financial crisis. Through concerted political effort, Gordon Brown and others, they've brought that system back to a level of equilibrium. So within a single system, you might have a crisis, but it's possible to come back to a level of equilibrium. But once you start to see polycrisis, crises in different systems interacting and feeding off each other, then it becomes much harder to kind of bring that back to equilibrium. And the quote at the bottom of the slide, which I won't read out, just kind of highlights some of the areas that they're focusing on. Particularly, I think, global heating and the environmental crisis as something that we've, potentially already lost control of, and that playing out in lots of ways, which comes ultimately to impact on schools. So in that same article, Lawrence and his colleagues, the diagram on the left here, which is not terribly clear, but what they're doing is kind of showing how these interactions take place across different systems. So where, that's not me, don't think it is. I definitely got up this morning. So you can see how different, economic turmoil and scarcity feeds through the decline of international cooperation, weakening international climate regime, pulling out of Paris climate agreements and so on, all interacts with extreme weather events. We've had one this week, interacting with other developments to then lead to, in this case, civil violence, interstate war, mass migration. And on the right, their diagram, they map out the 8 systems that they see as kind of global systems that are critical to this polycrisis. And what's interesting is it's quite hard to see education in there. I guess it's buried away under social order and governance, but it's not prioritized. It's not seen as a central site for attention in terms of the polycrisis. And yet my argument would be that it's very much part and parcel of the response to the polycrisis and very much impacted by the polycrisis. And if we just think of the migration issue, how schools are impacted when they're welcoming new arrivals who might be traumatized, they're trying to bring them into a school community that may have differing views about those arrivals, and all of the kind of community cohesion aspects that go with that. It's just one example of how the polycrisis is playing out and impacting on schools. So then I also want to suggest that that global polycrisis has particular kind of national flavors and local flavors. It will play out differently in each context. So here in the UK, we see how some of the global things, the global warming, the war in Ukraine, just to pick 2 examples, have led to certainly increased migration, which you can connect through to the rise of populism, the vote for Brexit, leading to further austerity because clearly the economy is further negatively impacted even beyond the global economic crisis, and therefore further welfare cuts, all of which plays out in terms of children's lives, families, communities that they live in, where sometimes you can draw a relatively direct line, but often it's a kind of indirect line, but how increasing poverty, inequality, stress and mental health concerns for children and young people, rising send, absenteeism, all these issues are kind of impacting on schools and seem to be accumulating. And what we're seeing in the sustainable school leadership research, which I'll talk a bit more about, is how school leaders are spending a lot of their time, if not most of their time, on trying to address some of these issues and being pulled away from the kind of educational outcomes that, when you see that slide I started with, the global consensus in terms of instructional leadership, learning-centered leadership, seems as if this is kind of becoming increasingly challenging to prioritize. And one of the reasons for that is that we have national policy frameworks, accountability frameworks, which hold schools accountable for this relatively narrow set of educational progress and attainment measures, for school quality indicators through inspections and so on. And I love this book, Seeing Like a State by James Scott. He's not talking about education. He's talking about kind of mostly agricultural development, kind of urban development schemes, often in developing contexts. But his argument is that over the last 2-3 centuries, modern states have evolved these kind of tools to make society legible, governable, to be able to kind of monitor and control aspects of social life and public life. But that in the process, this flattens or kind of ignores local knowledge, common sense, experience, and knack, or he uses the Greek term metis, the kind of local knowledge and wisdom about what's happening here and how do we make things work here, that gets ignored or flattened through these centralized mechanisms. And we've had a similar set of debates in the academic literature in relation to education, people like Jenny Oscar talking about datification, how modern states use standardized assessments, inspection results and so on to govern schools to control the work of school leaders. And I would see lots of parallels with James Scott's argument that in the process, ignoring the local knowledge of school leaders, the local responsive opportunities to work to address the poly crisis, because we're fixed on these national mechanisms and data. Now, there's lots more to what's going on with governance than just datafication, in my view. I think it's part of the issue that we face, but it's kind of mixed up with a wider set of developments in terms of system governance, where Denters and Rose and others have talked about this shift from government to governance, from more traditional bureaucratic oversight of schools, and we've heard various examples of that this weekend, towards what Hudson calls steering at a distance, using data to be able to kind of steer the system, but also other forms of coordination informed by new public management, so school autonomy, accountability, parental choice, and so on. And we see how governments on the left and the right have adopted these mechanisms and evolved them over time, often recognizing some of the pitfalls of these approaches. Hierarchical, bureaucratic approaches are seen to be slow and unresponsive and not good at moving knowledge around. Markets are certainly recognized to increase inequality. Where you have parental choice, you get increased stratification between schools, increased residualization in terms of more disadvantaged students pooling in certain schools. And so one of the responses of that has been to promote networks and kind of more lateral forms of collaborative organization as a way of trying to solve knotty, complex issues. And the classic argument is that we've moved from hierarchy to markets to networks. But Rob Heim and I, when we did the study on the self-improving school system in England, we developed these definitions you can see in the Venn diagram on the right. And I think what we saw in the 4 localities that we visited, the various other work we did, was how it wasn't as simple as that. It wasn't simply a case of networked, collaborative, self-improving systems. In fact, we felt that although there was that emphasis in the system, and similarly, there were lots of market incentives in the system that were driving competition between schools, ultimately, we argued that hierarchy trumps markets and trumps networks, certainly in the English school system, and I would probably argue elsewhere as well, in that school leaders had to pay attention to the national accountability mechanisms. And that meant often that they were faced with ethical dilemmas because they had to prioritize the needs of the school and make sure that it was seen to be doing well in terms of academic outcomes, in terms of good Ofsted inspection results, even if sometimes that meant that they had to deprioritize the needs of certain groups of children who maybe wouldn't do so well in those exams because they couldn't afford to be kind of, to bring the school's reputation down. Of course, many leaders didn't give in to that and were trying to do both at the same time. I'm not saying this is as simple as kind of hierarchy trumps everything, but I think it emphasizes the importance of leadership values, leadership agency, and leaders feeling trusted and empowered to make the right decisions, and how the system can detract from that. So then if we look at that same set of issues in a kind of slightly different way, I'm really interested, as I've said, in the local and the middle tier. What sits above schools? How does that work? How do schools work together on shared issues? And so what we see in these systems that I'm describing is this process that Chris Lubensky has called disintermediation, what Megan and her colleagues talked about in England as a multi-dimensional middle. Lots of different organizational structures and arrangements, but essentially a reduced middle as power and tools of control have certainly become more centralized. So we have national curriculum, national tests, national inspection frameworks, alongside increased school autonomy, school-based management, new public management. Often new providers being brought in, commissioned by central government to provide professional development and so on. And this plays out differently in different systems across the UK. Scotland still has strong local authorities, for example, so it's not always a consistent picture, but I'm interested in how, in a global poly crisis, do school leaders work to respond to that poly crisis and the changing kind of needs of children and families, And how do we help that, in particular in a place-based context where we have weakened opportunities for local governance and support? So this brings me to the Sustainable School Leadership Study. And apologies if you came to the symposium yesterday, you've heard some of this, but I'm just going to pick on some of the work we're doing in that project to exemplify some of the issues and what we see happening. So this is a UK-wide study focused on England, Scotland, Northern Ireland. We have that first question, the more kind of descriptive, how do the systems go about recruiting, training and retaining school leaders? Is that a sustainable model? But the second question opening up wider questions about how does it take account of individual, local and systemic needs? How do we think about things like diversity, equity, quality and fitness for the future? So trying to look forward as well as what's happening today. And we developed at the start of the project this conceptual framework, which we're continuing to kind of test and evolve as we go through the research. We think there's probably another circle to add to it, but what we're working with is this combination, overlapping combination of leadership on the one part, distributed, shared, contingent, process of influence geared towards collective goals, identity, where the individual clearly brings their own biography and their own beliefs and values that they have shaped through the course of their career, but identities are also held collectively. There's an identity to leadership, you know, what's it like leading around here in this place? There's identities that are held at national level. I'm a member of the Primary Heads Association, the Secondary Heads Association, which means we have a particular way of talking, a particular way of talking and believing as leaders. But the bit I'm going to focus more on is the place aspect of our conceptual framework, given my focus today on kind of the middle tier and place. And here we're drawing on work by lots of people beyond education, in particularly kind of geography, obviously, people like Doreen Massey and Cresswell. Some people have used this in education, and we're informed by that, including Pat Thompson and Christine Hall. Where on the one hand, we see places as a physical location and postcode place on a map, and that will have its geological features and so on, which will shape the nature of schooling and how things operate. But equally, places are much more kind of connected and in flow and in flux. They're home to communities which are evolving, imbued with personal and social histories, stories and meanings, framed by policies, not just education policy, but other aspects of policy, housing policy. We go back to the issue of migration. Here in England, local authorities housing migrant children and families and dispersing them to other parts of the country because the housing might be cheaper in that part of the country, meaning that you get schools that might have a sudden influx of children housed in local hotels. I was hearing a story about a school in the coast, on the coast in the north, that, you know, all the hotels are now housing migrant children and families. Lots of local families who tend to live in caravans throughout the year, but have to move out during the winter. You're not able to live in a caravan all year round. Very angry that they're not able to now move into the hotels. The prices have gone up and so on. So a whole set of kind of ways in which policy frames places and influences school leadership issues. Places are connected to other places at different scales, locally, nationally, globally. So this is this really important idea that everything's connected in a polycrisis world. We sometimes talk about how globalization tends to flatten places. Everywhere, all the high streets look the same. Everywhere has its McDonald's. But equally, what we recognize is that Apodori talks about places being context-derived and context-generative. They take those globalizing forces, they take those national policy-driven forces, and they shape them in relation to the particular stories and meanings and context of that place, which goes back to this idea of metis and why the knowledge of leaders about what it's like to lead in this place is so critical, but often so hard to articulate and hard to kind of reflect in national policy frameworks because it is so contextual and contingent. And place can be national as well as local. In our study, we're looking at these three national systems, and importantly, of course, education is a devolved responsibility in the UK, so the four systems have different arrangements for schooling and education and leadership. And I've put just a few. It's not impossible to do justice to all of the kind of differences, but just to kind of give you a quick flavour of some of those differences, you see immediately how England is by far the biggest, which adds a level of complexity. The headline issues on this slide come from a symposium we ran at AERA last year with BELMAS, where I was contributing alongside 3 other colleagues. So Tony Gallagher from Northern Ireland was talking about how religious divides and political challenges, post-conflict society shapes lots of the issues that leaders face in education in Northern Ireland. Ken Jones from Wales was talking about how PISA and declining PISA results have had a kind of impact on policy thinking and practice, and a kind of jolting to and fro of different responses to PISA. Chris Chapman from Scotland was talking about how it's, in many ways the most traditional of the systems, strong local authorities, relatively limited school autonomy. And then I was talking about England, the most neoliberal of the 4 systems, where things like academisation, particularly the rollback of local authorities, has led to fragmentation and this sharp school improvement, the famous Ofsted inspection, which kind of drives so much of how school leaders work and think. So we're looking at those 3 systems, and there's lots in the research that I'm not going to touch on, but I just want to throw a couple of slides up. This one is from the survey that we ran, that we closed in January this year, where we developed this list of items that you can see on the left from the qualitative interviews. We've done 7 place-based case studies, where in each locality we've visited a range of schools. We've interviewed potential leaders as well as serving head teachers. We've interviewed local leaders, people from the local authority, people from multi-academy trusts, providers of leadership development, for example. And one of the things we did with the school leaders, we asked them before we went to fill out a short pro forma saying what drains you in leadership and what sustains you in leadership. And then during the interviews, we've spent time talking about those issues. So on the left, these are issues we know from that qualitative research are important drains for leaders. And we know that all of them are really important. For some leaders, the things at the bottom, negative workplace culture, strategic and developmental concerns, would be their top drain. But in the survey, you get this sense of, where we've asked people to select 3 to 5, some common issues: poor work-life balance, staffing issues, financial resource constraints, the weight of leadership, the sheer kind of continuing level of responsibility that you're carrying that can get people down. If we go back to the idea of a crisis and how systems under stress, and then something happens that kind of causes the crisis to happen, the collapse of Lehman Brothers example, it can feel sometimes as if the weight of leadership, some leaders are feeling the heavy weight of leadership, but they're still thriving, they're enjoying the variety, the breadth of the role, they're feeling able to make a difference. But something might happen, a parental complaint that turns into a Facebook campaign or whatever, and that can kind of tip them over and become the thing that makes it feel unsustainable for them as individuals. But what I want to argue here really is that we could focus, and we are at policy level often trying to focus on some of these areas and trying to take policy decisions to support leaders in ways that will help to reduce workloads, to increase work-life balance, to improve the staffing issues. And that's important work to do, but I'm not convinced that simply putting those sticking plasters on will really make for a sustainable profession. I think we need to think more fundamentally about what would a sustainable model look like in a global polycrisis world. I've hinted at this already. So in the survey, we asked this question: approximately how much time do you spend on the following leadership activities in a typical week? And we gave them the option of saying none, less than 1 hour, 1 to 4, 5 to 10, 10 or more. And what's really interesting to me is that to go back to that global transnational leadership consensus that I started with, that instructional leadership is the heart of how leaders make a difference, how they improve outcomes for children. You've got 40-odd% who are saying they're spending 5 hours or more a week on leading, teaching, learning, and the curriculum. You've got 1% who aren't spending any time on it. But you've got a far higher proportion So what's that? 80%, 75% who are spending 5 hours or more on general administration each week. And you've got about 65, just under 65% who are spending 5 hours or more on student attendance, behaviour and well-being, including special educational needs and inclusion and safeguarding. So this, I think, reflects the point I'm making that school leaders are being pulled into a set of activities that are not about the classic educational leadership role. It's about inclusion, well-being for children, because that's what children need. That's the kind of absolute priority, to be able to support them to come to school and be successful. And yet our accountability framework is not supporting them with that. So this quote, lots of quotes I could have chosen. This is from a head teacher in Northern Ireland who says, I see myself as an educationalist. How much of my time is dedicated to education? Percentage-wise, 5%. Because he's busy with all those other things. And then there are literally thousands of quotes I could have chosen, but I've picked out one each from England, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, which highlight these other issues that leaders are being dragged into. In England, SEMH, so it's mental health, social and emotional mental health difficulties. I've never made a referral to children in mental health services up until this week, but I've made 3 real issues for our children. In Northern Ireland, I'm the lead counsellor of the school, supporting everybody's health and well-being for staff as well as students. And in Scotland, we appointed this family well-being worker. They started off with 8 families, now they have 40 families. This set of issues which stem from the poly crisis, in my view, driving the work of leaders, pulling them away from their classic transnational leadership package, leading teaching and learning responsibilities. So I'd be interested whether people see this in other systems as well. Now, it's important to say that this is not uncontentious. This is a hugely kind of big and I think under-discussed area, and that one of the recommendations from our research, I think, is going to be we need a debate about what schools are for. On the left, we've got a quote from Alexander, who's a local authority leader in Scotland. And he's saying some of these schools think they're community centres. And they're not community centres. I tell them they need to be education centres, not community centres. We went back to our 7 localities and we invited all of our participants to a workshop in each of the localities. And we played back, this is what we think we heard in this locality, and what do you think the implications of this research might be? And we had some really quite fierce debates with people, you know, on the one hand saying, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be teaching children to brush their teeth. We shouldn't be having to change nappies. That's the job of parents and carers, and the government needs to tell the parents and carers that it's their job to do it. And then we had others who said, this is the reality. If I don't go out and buy a mattress for this child who doesn't have a mattress at home and they don't get a good night's sleep, then they're not going to be able to learn. If I don't provide a food bank in this community where lots of children are not going to have breakfast and families are not able to feed them, then they're not going to be able to learn. And so I think it's not something that can be easily resolved. It definitely needs a debate. But then the question is, where does that take us? On the right, a single quote, but I could have picked out, I went through the survey and could have picked out at least 20 that capture this sense there in that quote, that the accountability framework, the league tables, the emphasis in inspections means that doesn't recognise the issues I face in this community. It doesn't allow me, doesn't value the work that I'm doing to provide the food bank, buy the mattresses, do the toothbrushing work, because it focuses me on just this single set of measures and metrics. And so we have this tension, I think, in terms of governance and practice. We have these local forms of knowledge, the METIS that James Scott talks about, that leaders are learning about how to respond in these difficult situations, and yet we're not managing to support them as successfully as we might. So where Scott lands with that is, firstly, at the beginning of that quote, he's saying there are incontestable benefits in terms of the hierarchical coordination of some tasks. So he's definitely not saying we just need to kind of go to an anarchic model in which schools are left to do whatever they want to do. He's saying we need hierarchical coordination in publicly funded school systems, but we need to recognise and accept a more multifunctional, plastic, diverse and adaptable form for our institutions, powerfully shaped by Metis. So we need to find ways to allow schools to do this work, to respond to the poly crisis, whilst also keeping the best aspects of hierarchy in a publicly funded, democratically owned, controlled system. So for me, this takes me to this idea of local solutions. Mike and I used to work at the National College for School Leadership, and we were given the responsibility for succession planning for head teachers back in 2006, 2007, and we adopted a local solutions approach to that. We said, we can't solve this nationally. It has to be local areas that understand where the leadership talent is, how to support leaders, how to develop and support the next generation of leaders. But we can help them to do that. We can give them resources, tools, support. We can help to move knowledge around so that areas are learning from each other. We can help to stimulate activity in places where there's less collaborative work on this agenda. And Bunton Harris wrote a good paper for the Institute for Government around this idea of mass localism or local solutions. And they start with this argument that this isn't about simply rolling back the state and kind of hoping that innovation will flourish, which was what the government, the 2010 government in England kind of tried to do with this idea of a self-improving school-led system. It's not simply about, I mean, it may be about stripping away some bureaucracy, but it's not mainly about that. Local solutions requires an active but facilitative approach from the centre, defining core principles, helping to stimulate networks and support local dialogue, learning and action. So it's an activist role at the centre, but it's not a controlling role. It's a facilitative role, helping to stimulate activity at the local level, helping to provide tools and resources. Clearly, one of the risks with this approach is that the communities that have the least resources are least able to address their challenges, and that you create greater inequality in the system. So I think that activist role includes directing resources very actively towards places that need most support. But the implication in terms of mindset shift is that we have to accept that different localities might have legitimately different priorities and ways of working. So rather than defining what success looks like at the centre and holding schools accountable, we would be saying, what is the priorities for this locality? How are you working towards them? What are you going to do about it? And how are you measuring your own success? And how do we help you to achieve that? So I flashed this report up at the beginning, the local ed evaluation that I'd worked on with Susan Cousin, where we were working with 9 localities across England. Really, really interesting project. All of those localities volunteered to be part of this project. They didn't get any money, but they were interested in how do we build local coherence. And they worked together in communities of practice. There was a national organisation called ISOS supporting them, so playing that kind of national facilitative role, if you like, but not defining what the localities would do. 4 of the localities focused on vulnerable children. How do we improve outcomes for vulnerable children? 4 were focused on how do we strengthen professional accountability across this locality. And 1 was a new combined authority working with multiple different local authorities. So a new kind of regional, sub-regional governance arrangement. And in the report that we published in January, we produced this model which reflected our findings. At the centre, you've got this idea of forging local coherence, and a lot of this being about kind of getting everyone onto the same page so that they can work together on shared issues. Collective moral purpose, building that sense of we all care about the children in this locality and we think that we can work together to achieve something, putting children's voice at the centre of that and children's needs at the centre of that, focusing on equity inclusion and working to kind of then build relationships, networks and trust. Secondly, you've got common cause, which is partly about a shared priority, but it's more than just, we've identified a priority and we're going to work on it. This sense of shared understandings is really important here. So if I take the 4 localities that were focused on vulnerable children, they all started with kind of a big data analysis, putting together databases, trying to understand which are the groups of children that are falling between the cracks, what are we going to prioritise, what are we going to work on. But then, helped by ISOS, the national team, they all undertook a kind of process of focusing on 10 case study children. This is what the human stories in green there refers to. They took 10 case study children and they really tried to dig into why are things not working for these children. And what they saw was that they were bouncing around between multiple services: school, social work, mental health, drug and addiction, police, GP, health, all these different services, but nothing quite working, nothing quite coming together. All four of them adopted school attendance as their kind of main outcome measure, on the basis that all those different services had different priorities, different objectives. But actually, if they could get children back to attending school consistently, then that was going to help with their mental health. It was going to help with their physical health. It was going to help with all sorts of other outcomes that these other services value, as well as their educational outcomes. And then integrated ways of working was about, how do we get that to work in practice? How do we do team around the child, team around the school, in order to really try and make sure that children get the support that they need to be back in school and succeeding, which has a whole set of issues wrapped up with it. So, to finish, I've talked about the poly crisis. I've talked about how it's impacting on schools. I'm saying that school leaders are struggling to spend time on leading, teaching and learning, but that's still really important and that we need to keep that very central. I'm saying that the locality and place is the opportunity to kind of strengthen the resilience of schools and school systems to be able to respond to the poly crisis, but that requires more coherent ways of working. Back in 2020, I wrote an article for the Journal of Education Policy looking at this issue, and I suggested there were these four perspectives on how change can impact at the local level. First, you've got the kind of tri-level reform idea: the national or the state, the local and the school working around a shared set of priorities. Similar here in England, we have the national literacy strategies, the national numeracy strategies. We're trying to do that kind of thing. It's very difficult to do and it's quite problematic. Then on the top right, you've got the Jenny Oscarite argument that local agency is fatally diminished in a context of highly centralized system steering through datafication and so on. Bottom left, you've got the Chris Lubensky argument that, and this is what I think we saw in the self-improving system research, was that it's possible for the local to remake itself, to kind of act entrepreneurially in order to kind of create new ways of working, but that this is ad hoc. Some places manage it, some don't, that certain players are privileged and certain players struggle to benefit through those models, so it's problematic. And then you've got Andy Hargreaves and Dennis Shirley talking about middle-out change, so a slightly idealized idea of kind of everyone collaborating, system leaders coming together and working in shared best interests. Putting together this talk makes me think there's a fifth option. I think local solutions is about trying to take the best of the hierarchical kind of facilitative setting of system level principles and active facilitation, but combining that with local agency, local knowledge, the metis that James Scott talks about, trying to build collective moral purpose, common cause, and integrated ways of working. And so in order to conclude, I was kind of thinking long and hard, you know, what do I draw on to try and pull all of this together? I've covered lots of territory. I could give a quote from Andy Hargreaves and Dean Fink, and their 8 principles for sustainable leadership, and that would absolutely capture a lot of what I'm saying. We need to think about leadership that sustains over time. We need to think about the future as well as the present and what sustainability looks like. That means depth and breadth in children's learning. All of those things would be true. I think it's really interesting in our study how different systems, and particularly probably Scotland, focuses in their leadership development in terms of helping leaders to articulate the values and beliefs that underpin their practice and how they bring that into their leadership. So I think there's things that I could be saying about leadership development here. But I decided to finish with a quote from one of the many leaders we spoke to, and we spoke to lots of really inspiring leaders. I've chosen Hugo for 2 reasons. Partly, he's one of the longest serving head teachers we interviewed. He's been 17 years at South Primary School in Englandshire, the head teacher. Partly because he was one of only a very small number who talked about environmental sustainability. So you go to the school and it's was built in the 1920s as a scout hut, relatively kind of simple building, wooden building. And in his 17 years, he says, I'm not an environmentalist, but I love the outdoors and I love nature. And over the years, talking to parents, talking to local people, I've kind of evolved this environmental vision for the school. And I've involved local craftspeople in doing up the school. And it's now this incredibly beautiful environment, lots of kind of wooden carving in the school, a green roof, a central courtyard where children are growing things. And what strikes me about Hugo is that he's sustained over time because he's got this very clearly articulated philosophy that underpins his work. He works collaboratively with other local leaders. He's working to form a local trust that can sustain them over time. And he says, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but just to pick out a few bits that really strike me. We believe that a community really brings up the child as much as any one individual. And I think if the child can feel safe and secure, then that's when they can thrive. And being part, feeling identity in a community is really important. I think we can all relate to that sense of belonging. It's a good foundation to do whatever you're going to do, whether it's to stay within that community or go further afield. So I think schools can't solve the poly crisis, clearly, but I think the answer to sustainable leadership and sustainable schooling in a poly crisis is to give more agency to school leaders across localities to work together on shared priorities and to put children's needs at the heart of that, and to keep this sense of place and locality as a foundation for children's belonging and agency as a really important part of educational purposes and means. Thank you very much. So we've got some time for questions and I think we have to use the microphone because it's being zoomed so that it can be recorded, sorry. Alison and then.
Thank you very much for centering the experiences of school leaders at such challenging times. What do you and your team consider through the Sustainable Leadership Project to be, what are your hopes for the reach and the impact of your work?
Wow, it's going to change the world. We're running, I think we've had really good policy engagement as well as practice engagement in all three systems, and we're running 3 policy workshops in the autumn where we're trying to then work through with colleagues what do they think the implications are for the particular system that they're in. And I hope that they'll, I think we've got some really useful findings. I think it's up to the systems to work out what do we want to do with that. And then I hope that we'll write lots of brilliant articles that will shape education policy and practice around the world. Nothing much. Tom and Mike.
Thank you so much. It's definitely this sort of work, I suppose, needs to be sustained. But I was thinking, your main message about the values coming from this idea of localism? Is it a message to the central government to support this? Would that be one of the main messages?
I think, yeah, my main message is local solutions requires a shift in mindset from central governments, a move away from trying to control schools. Definitely still playing a significant role. Definitely there's still a role for some quality assurance. I don't think this is about simply leaving schools to get on with it on their own. But I think the role of central government being kind of to step back, well, just to kind of step away from seeing it as all about them and step into trying to support localities to solve their local issues.
Any more?
Hello, I was wondering whether you thought there was any scope for the way that we measure schools to be changed to take account of some of these more holistic factors, because that seems to be one of the reasons why there is such a focus on progress and attainment at the cost of these more holistic issues like creating an environmental school. And people do that, but it tends to be kind of seen as an addition. And whether you think there's any possibility that that could happen within the current or future landscape, given that we're in a time of change for Ofsted particularly?
Yeah, really good question. So when Ellen and I were doing the Belonging Schools research, we knew we wanted to look at inclusive secondary schools, but we had this real challenge with how do you know if using national data, how do you identify the schools that are inclusive? And so we used something that Fisher Family Trust were developing at the time called the School Quality Index, which brings together a basket of measures that might arguably relate to inclusion and puts that together with progress for disadvantaged children to give you a kind of ranking of schools in terms of are they inclusive and do they get good outcomes. And they gave us the top schools in each region and we used that to sample, but we took the top 3 schools in each region and then we rang round local authority people, multi-academy trust people to try and triangulate and check whether that they were genuinely inclusive. And it was quite interesting. I mean, in the main they were, but there were some that people said, oh no, I wouldn't choose that one. And I think this is we could try and add more measures in to recognise the broader roles that schools play. We could try and recognise inclusion as well as attainment. But I think it's always going to be really problematic using national data. And that's the seeing like a state argument, that as soon as you kind of try and put this into single measures, you just flatten all of the nuance. So for me, I would kind of not try and add more measures. I would redesign the system to put much more emphasis on local priorities. And I would still want the locality to measure its priorities and whether it's making progress with those priorities, but I wouldn't impose those from the centre.
Any more? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you found there have been any particular tensions when you look at this idea of locality, the importance of place for, in England, national multi-academy trusts. So those trusts that have perhaps got very centralised, systematic ways of doing things that then arrive into local communities, potentially for the first time, and arguably perhaps look to impose some of their systems and approaches that have worked well, potentially for them in location A, but now become quite contested, even very difficult in location B. So I wonder if you found any of that tension. Definitely, yes.
That's the short answer. So the local learning landscape study that I flashed up at the beginning, that's quite a big issue we focus in on there. We're looking at professional development for primary teachers in mathematics in 3 different localities. And we include a series of kind of diagrams and things around, it's not always national trusts, but some trusts being very prescriptive, trusts having different capacities in relation to providing and supporting professional development for teachers in comparison with other schools. And what we see is that some localities seem better able to bring together a shared sense of collective moral purpose and kind of ways of working than other localities. And we highlight a number of issues. We talk about these landscape gardeners, people who seem quite often invisible, but they're kind of trusted expert people working within localities who are bridging between different organisational boundaries, sometimes working as part of a maths hub as well as part of a trust. And so we think there needs to be more attention to the landscape gardeners and helping to build that role as a kind of networked local capacity building, bridging kind of role in a fragmented system.
Time for one more.
Thanks, Toby. Really great presentation. It's a question about the sort of role of the local authority, I suppose, because I know we've become quite fixated in England about the sort of increasingly diminished role of the local authority in our system. And I know it's something that you've written about and I've written about and a lot of us are kind of concerned about. But of course, in Scotland, as you said, they've still got a very kind of traditional, strong middle tier. But it seems as if they've got similar issues up there that we have here. So I just wonder actually what your thoughts were on that, really, having had a chance to compare the 2 systems.
Yeah, really good question. And it's something we're definitely still wrestling with. Scotland might appear to be a kind of much more conducive environment for the kind of things I'm talking about because they've got that local authority capacity. And yet it seems like it works well in lots of places in Scotland. I'm not saying it doesn't work well, there's lots of concern about variation between local authorities and they're doing things differently, and can't quite work out in my mind whether that's misplaced. I think at national level, there's so much emphasis on consensus, and there's lots of policy. There's a working group and a kind of policy for everything. Colleague gave a paper yesterday kind of flashing up all the early years policies, you know, was one example of that. And so it can feel quite hard to kind of cut through to think what is the local solution? What are we working on as a local authority? It feels as if local authorities don't often feel able to kind of really say, this is what we're going to work on here. I think we do see examples of it in our research. In the city, it's really clear that they're focused on nurture as well as education, and they're really clear about that. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but that doesn't seem to quite work as well as it might ideally. Schools can feel quite constrained by the local authority. Just as in England, the rollback of the local authority in some places has led to some really rich collaboration and local school-led partnership, which we've both looked at as ways of kind of responding to that loss of local coordination. So I think whilst local authorities can be helpful, I'm not sure they're the straightforward answer to local solutions. We should probably stop.
Yes, I think we've just ran over a little bit. So thank you all so much. And thanks, Toby. That was amazing. Gives lots of things to think about. So yeah, on to the next session now, I think. Yeah, thank you.